sky over the Iranian plateau on February 28, 2026, was cloudless, but that stillness was merely a veil for the firestorm about to descend from the heavens. In absolute darkness, United States Air Force B, two Spirit stealth bombers glided through the atmosphere like silent ghosts, remaining entirely invisible to the sophisticated radar and air defense systems that Tehran had spent decades and billions of dollars perfecting. This was not a training exercise or a mere show of force. It was the commencement of Operation Epic Fury, an unprecedented and meticulously coordinated strike between the United States and Israel designed to fundamentally shift the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East in a single night. The core objective of this mission was not just the temporary disruption of military infrastructure, but the absolute and permanent eradication of the Islamic Republic's nuclear capabilities. The goal was to reduce its nuclear potential to a definitive zero, fulfilling the ironclad promise made by President Donald Trump. Within the highly secured Situation Room at Mar-a-Lago, the president and his top military advisors tracked the flight paths of the stealth fleet on high-resolution digital displays. As the massive GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing 30,000 pounds, began to drop from the bomb bays, the world remained in a deep slumber, entirely unaware that the global nuclear order was being physically torn apart. The primary destination for these steel monsters was Fordo, perhaps the most secretive and well-protected nuclear enrichment facility on the planet, buried more than 80 meters deep under the solid rock of a mountain in the Qom province. For over 15 years, Western intelligence agencies had studied every square inch of this facility, from the layout of the ventilation shafts to the specific geological composition of the mountain itself, waiting for the exact moment when destruction could be delivered with surgical precision. The first explosion did not roar across the surface, but instead vibrated from deep within the bowels of the mountain. The super-heavy bunker busters pierced through multiple layers of reinforced concrete and granite, racing down the main ventilation shafts at supersonic speeds before detonating at the very heart of the centrifuge halls. The resulting shockwaves, with no avenue for escape, rebounded against the stone walls with terrifying force, pulverizing thousands of high-tech centrifuges spinning at extreme speeds. In mere minutes, 19 years of Iranian uranium enrichment efforts were reduced to twisted metal and radioactive dust. Simultaneously, waves of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from United States submarines and warships positioned in the Persian Gulf rained down upon secondary sites in Natanz and Isfahan, systematically wiping out research centers and stockpiles of enriched uranium. At precisely 2:30 in the morning Eastern Time, President Trump took to Truth Social to deliver a message that sent shockwaves across the globe. He declared that Iran's nuclear capability had been completely and utterly wiped out, asserting that the Tehran regime would never again be in a position to threaten the United States or its regional allies with weapons of mass destruction. Trump characterized the strike as a noble mission for the safety of humanity, emphasizing that the United States had utilized secret technology and weaponry that no other nation on Earth possessed. This claim of zero potential was more than just a military status report. It was a crushing political ultimatum delivered to the heart of the Iranian leadership, forcing an immediate and brutal realization that their primary lever of international influence had vanished in an instant. As the sun began to rise, the scale of the devastation became clear, with black smoke billowing from government complexes and the once impenetrable nuclear sites, signaling the dawn of a new and uncertain era for the region. The dust had not even settled over the ruins of the Fordo facility when a second, even more catastrophic wave of intelligence began to circulate through the classified channels of global power. Israeli intelligence sources, working in seamless coordination with their American counterparts, broke the silence with a revelation that would forever alter the course of Middle Eastern history. The supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was dead. This was not mere speculation or a hopeful rumor whispered by dissidents. It was a confirmed reality backed by high-resolution photographic evidence that left no room for doubt. The strikes that had decimated the nuclear infrastructure were only one part of a multi-dimensional decapitation strategy designed to paralyze the Iranian state at its very core. As the news rippled through the corridors of power in Washington and Tel Aviv, the sheer magnitude of the event began to sink in. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, the Islamic Republic found itself without its ultimate religious and political authority, a vacuum of power that threatened to implode the entire structure of the regime from within. The tactical execution of the strike against the senior leadership was a masterclass in modern warfare and intelligence gathering. While the B-2 bombers were neutralizing the nuclear threat, a series of precision strikes utilizing stealth drones and specialized munitions targeted several secure bunkers where the highest levels of the Iranian government had sought refuge. These were locations thought to be impenetrable, hidden under layers of urban sprawl and protected by the most loyal units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Yet, The reach of the joint United States and Israeli operation proved to be absolute. The photographic evidence, which several sources indicated showed the lifeless body of the supreme leader amidst the rubble of a command center, became the ultimate symbol of the regime's vulnerability. This was the moment that many in the Iranian opposition had prayed for, and many in the Western intelligence community had meticulously planned for years. The suddenness of the loss left the remaining members of the military and political elite in a state of total disarray, unable to coordinate a coherent response or even confirm a line of succession. In the hours following the confirmation, the streets of Tehran, usually bustling with the morning commute, were instead filled with an eerie and heavy silence. The Revolutionary Guards, once the iron fist of the state, appeared paralyzed as their chain of command was shattered. Reports began to emerge of minor clashes between security forces and small groups of citizens who, sensing a shift in the wind, began to cautiously test the limits of the regime's control. This was exactly the scenario that President Trump had envisioned when he authorized the mission. In a direct and powerful appeal to the Iranian people, the president urged them to seize this unprecedented moment to reclaim their country and topple a regime that had held them in a grip of fear for generations. He spoke of an hour of freedom being at hand, a message that resonated deeply with a population weary of economic sanctions and political oppression. The message was clear. The United States had removed the primary obstacle to change, but the ultimate future of Iran now rested in the hands of its own citizens. The global reaction was a mixture of absolute shock and strategic recalculation. Traditional allies of Tehran, including Russia and China, were forced to watch from the sidelines as their primary regional partner was dismantled in a matter of hours. The speed and clinical efficiency of Operation Epic Fury had sent a message to the entire world that the military gap between the United States and its adversaries had widened to an insurmountable degree. In the Gulf states, there was a palpable sense of relief, tempered by a profound anxiety over what would come next. The disappearance of the supreme leader and the total destruction of the nuclear program meant that the primary threat to regional stability had been neutralized, but it also opened a door to a period of intense volatility as various factions within and outside Iran scrambled to fill the void. The geopolitical chessboard had been flipped, and as the world waited for the next move, one thing was certain. The Iran that existed before that fateful midnight strike was gone forever, replaced by a nation on the brink of a total and unpredictable transformation. Although the initial strike had paralyzed a significant portion of Iran's nuclear capabilities and decapitated the supreme leadership, the hope for a swift and clean collapse of the regime was quickly extinguished by the brutal reality of total war. As news of the Ayatollah's death spread, elite units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps did not disintegrate. Instead, they activated long-prepared contingency plans for mass retaliation. From mobile launchers hidden deep within mountain caves and densely populated urban centers, a barrage of ballistic missiles and suicide drones began to streak across the sky, aimed directly at United States military installations and major Israeli cities. Air defense sirens wailed incessantly in Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, forcing millions of civilians into underground shelters as the Iron Dome and Arrow systems worked at maximum capacity to intercept the rain of fire from above. The wave of violence did not stop there, as it rapidly spread across the Persian Gulf, targeting strategic United States interests. American diplomatic missions in Riyadh and Kuwait became targets of mortar fire and drone attacks, forcing Washington to order the emergency closure of these embassies. The United States State Department issued a dire warning, demanding that all American citizens leave the Middle East immediately. However, with commercial flights suspended and security situations deteriorating, the question of how thousands of citizens could safely evacuate remained unanswered. This chaos raised a massive question for strategic planners at the Pentagon. Had they fundamentally miscalculated Iran's resilience? Some experts began to fear that this was not the rapid overthrow seen in past geopolitical maneuvers, but a risk of becoming a prolonged and bloody quagmire, similar to the conflict in Afghanistan. In Tehran, the situation was spiraling toward the worst-case scenario. Reports of carpet bombing began to emerge as United States and Israeli air forces sought to eliminate the remaining missile launchers embedded within crowded residential neighborhoods. Smoke and fire engulfed the inner city, where talk of liberation and democracy once held sway, but which had now become a battlefield of horrific explosions. Meanwhile, the Iranian media apparatus, though disrupted, struggled to broadcast final calls for resistance, declaring that the nation would never surrender to the Great Satan. Hatred and the resolve for revenge surged among segments of the military and paramilitary forces, turning every street corner into a potential fortress. President Trump, in subsequent statements, maintained that there would be no stopping until the entire threat was removed. However, The fierce retaliation against Gulf allies and diplomatic facilities demonstrated a reality where the cost of victory could be far higher than initially projected. The entire Middle East was burning, and the line between a precise strategic strike and a regional great war was rapidly blurring. The world watched with bated breath, fearing that what had started with a stealthy blow in the night could end in a large-scale humanitarian disaster, as neither side showed any intention of backing down in this life-or-death confrontation. The geopolitical shockwaves were felt as far as Beijing and Moscow, with both powers warning that the continued escalation could lead to an uncontrollable global conflict. The economic markets reflected this fear, with oil prices skyrocketing to levels never before seen in the 21st century, threatening to plunge the global economy into a deep and dark recession. As the physical fires raged across the Iranian plateau and the Levant, a second front in this global catastrophe opened within the invisible realms of the digital world and the vital arteries of global commerce. The destruction of Iran's nuclear core was a surgical strike, but the regime's response was designed to be a blunt force trauma to the heart of the Western lifestyle. Within hours of the initial bombardment, the global energy markets experienced a shock unlike anything seen since the 1970s. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's total oil consumption flows, became a graveyard for commercial shipping. Iranian naval units, operating under decentralized command structures, deployed thousands of smart mines and launched swarms of fast attack boats equipped with anti-ship missiles. The message from Tehran was clear. If Iran cannot export its resources, the rest of the world will not have access to them either. Oil prices, which had been stable at $75 per barrel, surged past $150 in a single trading session, with analysts predicting a climb toward $300 if the blockade was not broken immediately. In the United States, the triumph of the midnight strike was quickly met with the harsh reality of modern asymmetric warfare. While the B-2 bombers were invisible to radar, the Iranian cyber warfare units, known as the Ashiane Digital Security Team, were anything but invisible to the American infrastructure. Reports began to flood in from major metropolitan areas, New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, of localized power grid failures and massive disruptions to the banking sector. Automated teller machines ceased to function, and digital payment platforms experienced unprecedented downtime. This was the invisible sting that the Pentagon had long feared. It was no longer a war fought 10,000 miles away. It was a war felt at the gas pump and the grocery store checkout line. The American public, initially supportive of a decisive blow against a longtime adversary, began to grapple with the immediate and painful consequences of a conflict that promised no easy exit. The geopolitical fallout extended far beyond the immediate combatants. In Moscow and Beijing, the mood was one of calculated fury and opportunistic positioning. The Kremlin issued a stern warning that any further escalation would be met with symmetrical measures, while China, heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil, began a series of high-stakes naval maneuvers in the South China Sea to distract American strategic assets. The world was witnessing the collapse of the post-Cold War order in real time. The United States, led by an administration that doubled down on its America First and Peace Through Strength doctrines, found itself increasingly isolated on the diplomatic stage. While many European allies privately cheered the removal of the nuclear threat, publicly they condemned the lack of consultation and the potential for a humanitarian disaster that could send millions of refugees fleeing toward the borders of the European Union. Inside Iran, the vacuum left by the Supreme Leader's death was being filled by the most radical elements of the Revolutionary Guard. These men, with nothing left to lose and their nuclear ambitions in ruins, turned their sights on the soft targets of the region. The luxury towers of Dubai and the massive desalination plants in Saudi Arabia were now in the crosshairs of a regime that felt it was facing an existential end. This was the dark side of President Trump's zero potential calculation. By removing the nuclear option and the top leadership, the United States had inadvertently removed the constraints that kept the regime operating within some semblance of traditional statecraft. The Islamic Republic was no longer a state seeking regional hegemony. It had become a wounded, cornered beast with a massive arsenal of conventional and unconventional weapons, determined to inflict as much pain as possible before the final curtain fell. The strategic masterstroke was rapidly evolving into a global endurance test, where the winner would not be the one with the most stealth bombers, but the one who could withstand the most economic and social chaos. While the White House continued to broadcast maps showing the total destruction of nuclear sites, the reality on the ground in cities like Tehran and Shiraz was far more chaotic and devastating. Reports began to emerge from the southern city of Minab, where a suspected airstrike had reportedly hit a civilian area near a girls' school. While the Pentagon scrambled to verify these claims and maintained that they never deliberately targeted non-combatants, the images of civilian casualties began to flood social media, providing a powerful propaganda tool for what remained of the Iranian state media. The narrative of liberation, which President Trump had championed from the start, was now being challenged by the grim optics of a nation under siege. In a televised address that evening, the president made a direct and emotional appeal to the Iranian people, telling them that the hour of their freedom was at hand and urging them to stay sheltered while the work of justice was completed. He told them to prepare to take over their government, calling it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reclaim their heritage from a tyrannical regime. However, the gap between the rhetoric of liberation and the reality of the military campaign was widening by the hour. The United States military, frustrated by the resilience of mobile missile batteries and the decentralized nature of the Revolutionary Guard's guerrilla tactics, began to shift toward a more aggressive bombing posture. In Washington, critics and strategic analysts began to ask if the administration had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the Iranian state. This was not a fragile house of cards like the regime in Venezuela, nor was it a fractured tribal society. This was a nation with a deep sense of historical identity and a military infrastructure designed specifically to survive an American air campaign. The comparisons to the early days of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars were becoming unavoidable. What was intended as a masterstroke to eliminate a nuclear threat was looking more like the opening chapter of a long and bloody regional war. The zero potential claim regarding nuclear weapons might have been technically accurate, but it ignored the 1,000 other ways a cornered and desperate regional power could inflict pain on a global scale. The situation was further complicated by the activation of Iran's proxy network across the Levant and Yemen. From the bunkers of southern Lebanon, Hezbollah began to launch heavy rockets into northern Israel, forcing the Israel Defense Forces to commit significant ground resources to a second front. In Yemen, Houthi rebels utilized advanced anti-ship missiles to further tighten the noose around the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, effectively cutting off the alternative route for global shipping. The United States and its allies were now fighting a multi-front war against an enemy that did not require a central command to be effective. Each local commander, fueled by a mix of religious fervor and the desire for revenge for the fallen supreme leader, acted with a brutal autonomy. The world's most powerful military was finding that while it could destroy high-value targets from 30,000 feet, it could not easily control the resulting chaos on the ground. The humanitarian toll was mounting, with millions of Iranians displaced and basic services like water and electricity failing in the heat of the desert spring. As the sun set on the fifth day, the question haunting the corridors of power in the West was no longer how soon they would win, but how they would define victory at all. If the goal was to eliminate the nuclear threat that had been achieved in the first 2 hours, but by killing the leadership and dismantling the state, the United States had opened a Pandora's box of sectarian violence and regional instability that no amount of precision bombing could close. The global economy was trembling, the Middle East was a sea of fire, and the Iranian people, caught between a falling regime and American bombs, were left to wonder if the freedom being offered to them was worth the price of their nation's total destruction. The stage was now set for the final, most dangerous phase of the conflict, where the line between strategic success and historic blunder would be drawn in the blood of those who had no part in the original nuclear dispute. The conclusion of Operation Epic Fury was not merely a technical military success, but a stark and sobering lesson on the limits of air power in fundamentally reshaping a nation. As the last B-2 stealth bombers touched down safely at their secret air bases, the nuclear map of Iran had indeed returned to zero, exactly as President Donald Trump had boldly and defiantly proclaimed to the assembled world media. However, the price paid for that zero was a Middle East standing precariously on the edge of a total and irreversible breakdown. Billowing black smoke from burning oil wells blocked vital maritime shipping routes, and a massive, echoing power vacuum in Tehran created a new global reality that no intelligence expert or strategic planner could have accurately predicted in its full scale of destruction. The surgical precision of the strikes had successfully removed the hardware of war, but it had also inadvertently dismantled the software of regional stability. The events of February 28, 2026, will be etched in the history books as a definitive testament to the absolute power of United States military technology and the unyielding decisiveness of its commander-in-chief. Behind the dry statistics of destroyed centrifuges and neutralized command bunkers lies a complex and dark story of global retaliation and mounting chaos. The removal of Iran's top leadership did not lead to the peaceful and orderly democratic revolution that optimistic Western observers had so loudly hoped for. Instead, it triggered a rapid and violent surge of the most radical military factions, men who were willing to utilize any brutal means necessary to protect what remained of their shattered power. Large-scale cyber attacks on American civilian infrastructure and the strict, mine-laden blockade of the Strait of Hormuz prove that a nation, even one stripped of its nuclear ambitions, could still inflict immeasurable economic and social damage on the entire world. From a deep geopolitical perspective, Operation Epic Fury has completely changed how nations perceive the concepts of red lines and strategic deterrence. Major adversaries of the United States, from the Russian Federation to China, are now forced to recalculate every strategic move when facing a Washington administration that is willing to use ultimate power to protect its interests without going through any traditional diplomatic channels or seeking international consensus. The post-World War order, based on multilateral treaties and slow-moving diplomacy, has been abruptly replaced by an era of unilateral action and overwhelming, instantaneous military force. For the Gulf allies, the disappearance of the Iranian nuclear threat brings a temporary and fragile relief, but it also opens a volatile new chapter where the traditional balance of power in the Middle East has been completely torn apart, leaving a vacuum that many fear will be filled by even more unpredictable forces. In his final, proud statements following the mission, President Trump asserted that humanity owes the United States a sincere and lasting thank you for bravely confronting an existential danger head-on. He emphasized that the doctrine of peace through strength was no longer just a campaign slogan for the history books, but a vivid and undeniable reality proven on the battlefield. However, the legacy of this historic strike will remain a subject of fierce and polarized debate for many decades to come. Was the successful prevention of a future nuclear bomb truly worth the immediate chaos and humanitarian suffering the region is now enduring? As diplomats and world leaders work to pick up the shattered pieces of international relations, the definitive answer to that question still lies in the uncertain future ahead. Finally, the script of Operation Epic Fury is complete, but its deep and haunting implications will echo through the halls of history for generations. The world witnessed an unprecedented and terrifying display of power, an event that changed the geopolitical landscape in a single, short, and violent night. From the desolate and radioactive ruins of the Fordo facility to the hauntingly quiet and smoke-filled streets of Tehran, a new world order is slowly emerging from the ashes and the smell of gunpowder. It is an order where Iran's nuclear zero is both a singular great achievement and a stern, permanent reminder of the terrible price of peace in an era of borderless and asymmetric conflict. The story of America and Iran has turned a completely new page, where the ghosts of the past have been wiped out, but the unprecedented and daunting challenges of the future are beginning to emerge more clearly than ever before.